Good morning. So, thank you very much for quieting down. Good morning and welcome to the Red Bank Humanist Darwin Day Forum. I'm Eric Seldner, the president of Red Bank Humanists, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The Red Bank Humanist is a nonprofit organization which promotes the ideals and the principles of the philosophy of secular humanism. Secular humanists do not rely upon gods or other supernatural forces to solve their problems or to provide guidance for their conduct. We turn our attention to the living and away from hearsay about the wisdom of the long dead. We rely upon the application of reason, the lessons of history, and our own personal experience to form an ethical foundation and to create meaning in life. The Red Bank Humanist promotes these ideals by producing educational programs like today's forum and other events that you can find out about on the Red Bank Humanist website. You can also look out for emails in your email, or you can follow us on Facebook or check on Meetup for our events. We hope you choose to join our community and become a member of RBH. It's only $30 a year for an individual or $45 for a family. Your support is what makes it possible for us to produce events and programs like this. So our annual fundraising drive is wrapping up. So this is a good last chance to contribute. You can do that by visiting the website, or I suppose you could also find me, or you can find Alex to
make yourself coffee.
And our community outreach group collection this month is for the Park Family Health Center. The links are in e-news and on the website for that. Took me a little while to get the coffee today. Last time they were really quick, so I allotted a little less time today, and this time they weren't as quick. We might be able to ameliorate that situation if people want to volunteer for like one month a year. There's a sign up by the coffee, and it's not complicated. I can even order it in advance, and you can just pick it up. That's really all we need. Sometimes someone else is getting the snacks. Sometimes it's combined, but we can work that out with whoever wants to volunteer. Definitely could use some help in that arena. Okay, so as always, in February, we celebrate Darwin Day on this date. It's on this date, February 12th, back in 1809. That was the actual birth date of Charles Darwin. We celebrate Darwin Day because Charles Darwin's discovery of the common descent of all living creatures and the discovery of the process of natural selection are fundamental to the humanist philosophy. Before Darwin, scientific and non-religious thinkers could doubt religious teaching about the genesis and the nature of life, but they had no alternative explanation. Darwin's theory of evolution, that was thoroughly proven through fossil discovery in the genetic relationships of all living things, provided that alternate explanation for the first time. Other scientists in many fields have strengthened and broadened our evidence that the faith-based story of creation and the purpose of humanity is false. But Darwin was the first to provide a comprehensive natural explanation for the living world. And that is why defenders of religious faith refuse to accept evolution as a fact and heap scorn on Darwin and his theory. Darwin explained how life could be so complex and varied without a creator, that there was fossil evidence and living evidence that no God created the diversity of life. He was brilliant in seeing this pattern, painstaking in cataloging thousands of examples of his theory, and brave in his willingness to publish his work, knowing that he endangered himself in challenging religious orthodoxy.
Could you copy
Brilliant, painstaking, and brave, he put our intuition that we have no creator on a solid basis of evidence.
Of pastel
For
pens,
that,
it should be
we
on the
honor
left side
Charles
of my
Darwin on
desk.
his birthday today.
Yeah, thank you.
And now on to our program. Today we welcome back our own Ron Flannery. And I don't know if you want the full formal introduction, but Ron is a computer scientist, futurist, and is a Red Bank Humanist board member. He's also our webmaster and has often managed the videos for our forums. Ron has a great mix of a scientific mind, a salesman's persuasion, and an actor's talent that makes for a wonderful forum program. He has spoken to us many times on many topics, from the psychology of art to genetics to artificial intelligence, and today he's going to talk about the microbiome. So please give a warm welcome to Ron.
Okay, am I on? Yeah. Is my microphone on? Yeah, we're good. Okay. Louder. Yeah. Am I on now? I'm on now. Turn it down. Turn it down. Okay. Thanks for coming out. I appreciate the turnout. That's terrific. Today is many consider the most important holiday, Super Bowl Sunday. But it's a lot of other things as well, Darwin Day being one of them. The last time I came up here, not the last time, the time before, I did a talk on epigenetics. And epigenetics folds into this talk very well, because one of the problems that comes up when you talk about something like epigenetics is, yeah, that's all great and good. I understand what you're saying, but what am I supposed to do about it? Well, the microbiome is the key to what you can do about it. So it's very important from that aspect. Okay, there's got to be a way to do this. There it is. You are what you eat, and that's going to become abundantly obvious as we go through this. The whole idea of the microbiome was first discovered by a Russian zoologist, this guy, Elie Mechnikov. He discovered it back in the early 1900s. And his whole thing was based on the fact that his mother and his mother's family lived to be very, very old by the standards of the day. The life expectancy of a white male back in the early 1900s was 45, 46 years. That was it. And yet his family was living to be in their 70s and their 80s. And he couldn't actually point to anything that they did specifically, except they came from a part of Bulgaria where everybody drank yogurt. So he thought maybe that had something to do with it. And he developed a whole concept of aging based on this lactobacillus that lived in the yogurt and actually made the yogurt what it was. He went to work with Louis Pasteur. He went to the Pasteur Institute, and Pasteur invented the whole germ theory idea of how diseases are caused by microbes. And it's considered one of the most important discoveries of medical history. And this is also when he was in Paris working with Pasteur, this is when there was an outbreak of cholera in Paris. So what he wanted to do was study cholera. So he made up a soup of cholera and he drank it. And he figured, well, I'll get cholera and then I'll use myself as a test subject and figure out, but the thing is, he didn't get sick at all. So that kind of surprised him. So he went to a friend of his and he said, look, I made this cholera soup. I didn't get sick. Maybe I didn't do it right. Could you take it? So his friend did, and he didn't get sick either. So Mechnikov is thinking, what am I doing wrong here? I mean, it's germ theory. I see the germs, I'm eating the germs. So he got to a third guy and he said, look, I took it, didn't get sick. He took it, didn't get sick. Would you try it? So the third guy tried it and he almost died. So the cholera soup worked, but it didn't affect Mechnikov. And he figured that the only difference was maybe the difference in intestinal microbes. So if you have a lot of good intestinal microbes, maybe that's what protects you from disease. He also thought a lot about aging and the Bulgarian peasants and their yogurt consumption, and he came up with that whole theory based on Lactobacillus bulgaricus And he said, well, that's probably it, you know, and how can we test this and so on. And to validate his theory, he drank sour milk every day throughout his life. Now, in the literature, it says sour milk. I don't know if that means yogurt or if it means kefir or what, but he drank it every day of his life. He lived to be 71. So as far as he was concerned, up until he died, you know, this is the proof. And this concept of probiotics, he called orthobiosis, and it was influential, but after he died, everybody just forgot about the whole thing. So it disappeared. It didn't actually start coming back until the early 2000s. And you can see that the number of papers referencing microbiome in 2006 was practically zero. And up around 2017, we're getting over 4,000, 5,000 papers on the microbiome. So it's being recognized now. But this is a brand new science. If you think about it in you know, the terms of science in general, just like epigenomics is a brand new science. The number of papers, I did a Google search on human microbiome, 64,800,000 results. And if that's any indication, then clearly we're starting to take a lot more interest in this. Turns out that there are, according to some papers I've read, more bacterial cells on you and your body than human cells. And there's no disagreement on that, but it's the disagreement on how many. Some papers say there are twice as many bacterial cells in your body than human cells. And some say, well, there's just a little bit more. And every time you go to the bathroom, you become more human. But your body contains about 40 trillion bacterial cells, and that's a lot. They're bacteria, they're viruses, and they're fungi, mostly yeast. So you are more microbiota than you are human. There are up to 1,000 species of bacteria in the human gut microbiome. So right now you're carrying around a whole civilization of microbes in your guts. And they all play a role in how your body functions. I'm going to take you through that. They weigh altogether about 3.5 pounds, which is how much your brain weighs, right? So it's an organ. You're carrying around a symbiotic colony that makes up basically an organ in your body, and they're called the microbiome. And you can see I did a search on the human spleen. I figured, you know, that's another organ in your body, and I got 67 million hits. So there's almost as much interest now in the human microbiome as there is in the spleen. The Human Genome Project estimated that the number of genes in the human genome would to code for the proteins required to sustain your physiology would be about 100,000. Now, if you were here for my talk on epigenetics, you know that some DNA that you carry around codes for how to build proteins and enzymes and how to construct your body and so on. But there's a whole bunch of DNA that encodes the software that determines when things happen in your DNA and how much happens in your DNA and when it happens in your DNA. So after they did this research, it turns out that there are only 20,000 protein coding genes in your DNA, same as a fruit fly. So as far as producing proteins, we're no more complicated than a fruit fly. But where we are really complicated is that software that determines which proteins get produced. So human DNA plus microbiome DNA, if you add it together, now you get 100,000 genes. So collectively, if you consider your microbiome as part of you, then you're a superorganism. And the human microbiome, it turns out, provides traits which you as a person have not evolved to do for yourself. I'll show you some evidence of that. So if it wasn't for your microbiome, you wouldn't be the kind of human everybody expects. So to start off, a microorganism is a chemical factory. You can think of it that way. They've got inputs, they do processing, and they have an output, right? And the chemicals that they produce include all kinds of things that are beneficial to humans or detrimental to humans. But the good microbiome produces vitamins, neurotransmitters, short chain fatty acids, and a bunch of other things. that are used by the body that we can't produce ourselves. They also break down food and produce energy and nutrients, and I'll hit on that again. They produce chemicals that train and maintain our immune systems. The majority of your immune system actually lives in the lining of your guts. They produce chemicals essential to early development. So when you were a baby, if you had the wrong microbiome, you might not develop as a normal human being would. And they're the first line defense against pathogens. I'll talk about that more too. And they create colonization resistance. So we have a symbiotic relationship with all these microbiota, and we benefit from what they can do for us that we can't do on our own, and they benefit from us because we give them a nice place to live and we feed them and they get to propagate through generations inside our bodies. So it's a good deal all around. It's a true symbiotic relationship. Your body contains multiple environments for microbiota. They're in your brain, they're on your scalp, but they're different microbiota in your brain than it would be on your scalp because it's a different environment. They're in your ears, they're in your nose, your mouth, your lungs, your skin, your gut, your vagina, if you're lucky enough to be a woman. And each of these is a unique and different micro environment. So it has a unique and different microorganism set. And in different people, they're totally different. So the microbiomes that I use to digest carbohydrates in my body may be the same or different than the microbiome that you have that digests carbohydrates. So we could be completely different in our population of microbiota. A microbiome that tunes my immune system may be different than yours. That impacts my hormones might be different than yours, and so on. The National Institute of Health committed $100 million to the Human Microbiome Project, something you probably never even heard of. And they had specifically targeted the oral cavity, the nasal cavity, the gastrointestinal tract, the genitourinary tracts, and the skin. So I'm going to hit on the skin first. And you see there's a footnote down there. They had 250 volunteers that they used for this study, and it's a 2-year-long study. Your skin is your largest organ, and there are trillions of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, viruses, living on your skin, and they all have an impact. Now, if your skin was the world, then it would have different environments. You would have a desert, and you would have a swamp, and you would have a place behind your ears that's different from what's going on inside your nose or what's going on in your armpit or between your toes. So what lives at different places on your skin depends on the environment that's there, because some environments are conducive to one kind of microorganism and not to another. The purpose of your skin is kind of to protect you from the outside world, right? So the skin microbiome is part of that protective layer. It helps your immune system work because microbes in your skin act as a kind of warning flare, alerting your immune system to harmful bacteria or viruses. And this is where it ties back into your epigenome, right? How do they communicate with you? They produce chemicals that trigger epigenetic responses. So microbes in your skin will trigger an epigenetic response, and that causes your DNA to generate the appropriate proteins and enzymes to fight off infections. And they play a role in how your cell responds to things like UV light, which causes skin cancer. So signals from your skin microbiome can activate or deactivate your immune system, and that helps you heal. It controls inflammation. It fights infection. Some microbes act like a natural antibiotic. Remember penicillin. That's a mold that grows on bread, and it's an antibiotic, and it's a natural antibiotic. And you have molds that grow on your skin that do the same function. They also keep your skin acidic. And a lot of germs don't like acid, an acid environment. So having a good microbiome population on your skin prevents you from infections that germs that don't like these acids. Now, a normal microbiome is a very rich mix of various different kinds. The more diverse your microbiome, the healthier you tend to be. If you get an imbalance, though, and you get too much of the wrong kind of microbes, that's called dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is when a healthy microbiome goes too far in one direction or another. And there are different ways that can happen. It can be altered by having a disease or taking a lot of antibiotics. But usually it bounces back to the normal state. But if it goes off, what can happen is you start with a normal microbiome and it gets perturbed in some way. You get the disease, you take a bunch of antibiotics or whatever, and maybe you have some microbes in your system that are resistant to the antibiotic and they don't get diminished enough. So when your microbiome recovers, you get too many of that bad bacteria or that bad fungus. And then you have a disease situation. Some of the diseases you can get on your skin because of this dysbiosis could be eczema, psoriasis, acne, rosacea, and wounds that don't heal. Now you wonder how we became this symbiotic relationship. How do we develop a symbiotic relationship over millions of years with microbes? Because it's kind of a strange idea, right? Why would microbes be essential to being healthy? If you look at the tree of life, where it starts is with bacteria and archaea. And bacteria and archaea have been around the longest in the whole history of evolution. So if you start with a simple primitive organism, like this roundworm here, and it's in an environment where there are microbes like a lactobacillus, you have one of two or three situations that could occur. The organism could have an environment on its surface that is conducive to the growth of lactobacillus, or it could be producing antibodies that resist lactobacillus. And it's a crapshoot, right? It's just nobody planned the environment. Nobody planned how this would react. Well, lactobacillus is characterized by the ability to produce lactic acid. And lactic acid, as I mentioned, provides an acidic environment which germs don't like. So if there's an environment here that welcomes lactobacillus and they're allowed to grow, then they're going to produce an acidic environment. And this is going to be it's going to tend to be a much healthier worm. So lactic acid repulses the other bacteria, and a good environment says you're going to have, a bad environment says you're going to have fewer of these, you're going to get more infections, and that's going to lower the viability of current and future generations. So that would be bad for the worm. So it's not going to reproduce very well, it's not going to have healthy offspring. If it's got a good environment, though, that's going to increase the viability of current and future generations. So the offspring of one that welcomes lactobacillus are going to be more plentiful. So from an evolutionary standpoint, it makes sense that this symbiotic relationship would tend to develop and strengthen over time. It's not planned. The primitive simple organism had no thought about this. Nobody said, let's do this. It's just, it happened to have a good environment. And the same with the bacteria. Nobody planned it. It just happened to find this good environment and proliferate. It could be more complex. Maybe the lactobacillus produces chemicals that trigger epigenetic responses that are favorable or unfavorable. So again, a symbiotic relationship at that level could develop over millions and millions of years. And this roundworm, right, we're going back 600 million years. So that's a long time for this kind of evolutionary development to take place. Wherever and for whatever reason, there is an increase in the viability of current and future generations, the organism and the bacteria, though, will co-evolve in this symbiotic relationship, and they'll just get stronger and healthier. The host organism will depend on the microbiota over time to produce molecules that it doesn't produce, but they're there because of the microorganisms, right? So it'll come to depend on those microorganisms. Let's take a look now at the genitourinary tract. The lower vagina, the upper vagina, and the cervix all differ in the flora that are there. And this, Most of what's going on in there, though, is lactobacillus. And lactobacillus, again, they take sugars, they convert it into lactic acid, a little alcohol, and some gases. And if you have a healthy microorganism in your vagina, it's going to consist mostly of these lactobacillus. And bacterial vaginosis is the most common condition, and it's characterized by the disruption of the equilibrium of the normal vaginal microbiotes. And a proof of this is if you take a lot of antibiotics, a lot of times you'll have a side effect, which is like maybe a yeast infection, right? Because the balance got thrown off by the antibiotics. And then as you age, it changes. The environment changes, so the populations change over time as well. And the whole point of this is that they are going to competitively, even as you age, continue to prevent diseases for you. Now, one of the ways that can get thrown off is through things like sexually transmitted infections and urinary tract infections, but they're protected by the lactobacillus, which make the environment acid, and they change the pH. But the things that disrupt it, again, the use of antibiotics can throw things off. Hormonal contraceptives can throw things off as well, because the hormones affect the bacteria just like they affect you. Sexual activity, vaginal lubricants, douching, things like that. But you notice over time, the majority of these problems are caused by us and the things we're doing. It's the introduction of things like antibiotics and hormonal contraceptives and lubricants and things like that. Let's take a look at the oral cavity now. This is what happens when you eat, right? This figure here, this is called a torus, and in a study of mathematics called topology. And a torus is anything with a hole that goes through it. So a coffee cup, because there's a hole in the handle, that's a torus, even though it's a different shape. Well, the human body is a torus. We have a hole that goes all the way through us. Starts at your mouth, ends at your anus. So this is called the alimentary canal. And if we took a trip down the alimentary canal, which we're going to, we'll see what happens when you eat. Starts in your mouth. There's a microbiome in your mouth. It's one of the largest microbiomes in your body. You've got thousands of microbes in your mouth. They're bacteria, they're viruses, they're fungi. They live in your saliva. They're on every surface of your mouth. And interestingly, the microbial flora on the lip side of your teeth is different than the microbial flora on the tongue side of your teeth. It's highly varied because these things are really, really, really small. There are over 700 species of bacteria living in your mouth. And some of them, lactobacilli, we already talked about those guys. Bifidobacteria, this is a bacteria that's necessary for the digestion of breast milk. If you didn't have this as a baby, you couldn't digest breast milk. Some of these you've also heard of before. You know, this is the one that gives you gingivitis, right? This is one that gives you a staph infection. This is a fungus, or a yeast rather, that you might have heard of, streptococcus. And you get these from the day you're born, you start getting populated. And eventually you're going to have billions of these things in your mouth. And what do? They maintain homeostasis within your mouth. They protect the mouth from disease-causing invaders. They transport oxygen to the gum. They remove waste from the surfaces of your mouth. They help remineralize tooth enamel. So they're really good for your teeth. And who would have thought, right? And they promote well-being throughout your body. Functions like these are beneficial to your oral microbiome, and they prevent things like oral diseases. And every time you swallow, a lot of these microbes then travel down your alimentary canal, and eventually they end up in your gut. Systemic diseases can be caused by the oral microbiome going wrong. And diseases that we found to be caused by this are things like heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. Inflammation can be caused. Immune dysregulation can be caused. So your immunity to certain diseases can be upset if your microbiome gets dysregulated. You can get problems in the cardiovascular, digestive, immune, and nervous system, including periodontal disease. Cardiovascular disease is associated with it, strokes, high blood pressure, endocarditis, atherosclerosis can be a result. Also, your mental health can be affected by your oral microbiome going wrong. Emotional and mental well-being is actually impacted by these things going wrong. There's a thing called the gut-brain axis connection, which I'll address a lot later, but it influences your levels of anxiety and how you deal with anxiety, your levels of depression and how you deal with depression as early as birth. Type 2 diabetes can be a side effect of having a poor oral microbiome. Gum disease is associated with it. Obesity is associated with it. Multiple oral bacterial taxa are significantly associated with obesity. So if you have an obesity problem, you can go have your microbiome looked at, and they can tell you if there's a disbalance. There are companies that actually do this for money now, and you can send them a sample in the mail, and they'll send you back a whole profile of your microbiome. Adverse pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth and preeclampsia, low birth weight in a baby, a higher rate of miscarriage, infertility can all be associated with this. Sexual dysfunction, erectile dysfunction, vaginal dryness, rheumatoid arthritis, AIDS is even associated with it. There's a noticeable difference in the oral microflora of those with and without AIDS. And you might consider now, is it having AIDS that causes the disruption, or is it the disruption that contributes to catching the AIDS? So we're going to have to take a look at that as we go forward. Osteoporosis and periodontitis, loss of bone mineral density, cirrhosis of the liver, chronic liver diseases can all happen because of your microbiome in your mouth, and then you swallow. You got a question, Mike? Well, I'll talk to that later. Okay, now let's take a look at the gastrointestinal tract, because we swallowed, right? And a lot of that microbiota went down into our stomach. Now, before you eat anything, and this is true of almost every animal that eats anything, before you eat it, you smell it, right? Why? Well, if you look at the earliest stages of development of any kind of life form, they live in an environment where they either have to go towards food or away from food, towards an environment, away from predators. And the only way they can do that is if they can sense the chemicals in the environment. And that's basically the sense of smell. So the sense of smell is really important. So before you eat anything, and we all do this, we have a tendency to smell it first, because that's really, really important for survival. The analysis of smell and taste improves the viability of current and future generations, because you want to smell something to see if it's going to be palatable, and you want to remember it. So there's a very tight connection between the sense of smell, the sense of taste, and the brain, and it's a very direct connection. Every one of your senses goes through an organ in your brain called the thalamus, and it gets redirected to different parts of your brain. So when you look at something, your visual cortex has to be served up what your eyes see, but before it gets there, it goes to the thalamus, and the thalamus says, okay, this is visual information. I'm going to send it to the visual cortex, but I'm also going to send it to the part of the brain that takes care of auditory information, because maybe what I'm looking at is somebody speaking or an animal making a noise, and I want to associate the sounds with what I'm looking at. And it sends that information to various parts of the brain. If it's speech, it has to go to the part of the brain that analyzes speech. The sense of smell doesn't do any of that. It goes straight to the brain. It bypasses the thalamus altogether, and it goes to the part of the brain that reacts to emotional stimulation and memory. The sense of smell is very, very tightly associated with memory. And if you want to remember something from the 6th grade, pick up a book you read in the 6th grade and smell it. And you'll be amazed how the sense of smell will take you back in time, where your other senses won't do that necessarily. And it's an immediate response. So there's a direct connection between the sense of smell and the brain. And you'll see why this is important as we go forward. The question being, is there a similar thing that's going on between your gut and your brain, right? Because what is the whole point of smelling something and tasting something? Well, you ask yourself a bunch of questions. Have I smelled this before? Did I have a good experience when I ate that thing? And you want to remember that. Or did I have a bad experience? Was it? And it generates, if it was a bad experience, it generates an emotional response called disgust, right? And that's something you remember. So if you smell that thing again, maybe you'll get disgust. But what if you ate something and it turns out it was a magic mushroom and it doesn't hit you until later? So your sense of smell doesn't know, but your brain has to remember that because you may or may not want that to happen again. So is there a mechanism in your digestive system that has similar importance? Well, clearly there is, because we have it built into our language. We say things like, trust your gut. Trust your gut reaction to this. Do you have butterflies in your stomach when you're asked to do a presentation? Do you get sick to your stomach when you think about a particular thing? So something in your head is connected to something in your gut. What happened 4 hours after you swallowed that green apple? Is that something you want to remember? And what happened 12 hours after you swallowed that mushroom? Is that something you want to remember? So we'll get back to that. So anyway, you chewed something, you swallowed it, it was partly digested in your mouth, it goes into your stomach's a muscle, it's going like this, and it's crushing that food up, and it's turning it into smaller and smaller bits. And that goes into an area called your duodenum. That's this bulbous area here at the bottom of your stomach, and that's the introduction into your small intestine. So the first section of the small intestine that receives food is called the duodenum. And there's this is where your gut microbiome really begins. There's a very healthy population of microbes in the duodenum, and they aid with the digestion. This is the beginning of your gut microbiota, and that introduces everything into your lower intestine, and your small intestine rather, is 22 feet long. It's a huge thing. If we stretch it out, it goes from here to that wall. And what goes on in your small intestine is all those small molecules that have been crunched up by your stomach travel through all of that, and it's surrounded by blood vessels. And the blood vessels suck up all the nutrients. So the fats get sucked up by fat vessels. The sugars get put into your circulatory system and so on. After it leaves there, it goes into your large intestine, and it comes in here. This is the bottom of your small intestine, and here's your appendix, and there's an area called the cecum, and this is where most of your gut microbiome lives, okay? The 100 trillion bacteria in the body of an adult human contain about 4 million distinct bacterial genes, with more than 95% of them located in the large intestine. Most of them are there in the cecum. So most of what they do for you happens here. And this is kind of strange, isn't it? Because most of the digestive processes have already happened, you would think. Turns out that's not entirely true. About 15% of the energy you get from food comes right here, because this is where fiber gets digested and things that you can't digest at all. The microbiome does it for you. So that's again part of that symbiotic relationship. So your large intestine, absorbs a lot of stuff, mostly water, but also some minerals and remaining nutrients from your food, 15%. The bacteria breaks down the fiber, which is important. They produce some things that you can't produce, like vitamin K and vitamin B, all produced there in the cecum. And it would improve your viability of current and future generations if somehow that part of your body could communicate with your brain and say, hey, that was good. There were a lot of good nutrients in there. There were a lot of good fiber in there. Eat more of this. Or that was good, but too much of it is a bad thing and it's going to make you sick. So eat less of this, or don't ever eat that again. Now, what that implies is somehow your gut is telling your brain what you should be craving and what you should be avoiding. It's controlling your appetite. So is that true? Well, it turns out, if it was true, then that would improve the viability of current and future generations. So from a Darwinian perspective, it would be nice if it was true. Turns out the gut bacteria secretes hormones that do affect your brain, and the brain secretes hormones that affect your gut and your digestion. And inflammation in the gut, for example, causes messages to be sent to the brain that will affect things like how you behave and what you want to eat and so on. Where does this all come from? Well, when you're born, before you're born, there is almost zero microbiome in your body. When you're born, well, before you're born, right? You're clean. There is no microbiome. Most of the microbiome that you get as an infant comes as you pass through the birth canal. It gets smeared over your body and you inhale it and you swallow it and so on. And so that's your introduction to the microbiome right there, which has implications for natural birth versus cesarean birth, being born at home versus being born in a hospital, being born on a farm versus being born in a penthouse apartment. But it turns out that that microbiome, as you're being born, impacts your brain development, the development of your immune system, your overall health, your appetites, your anxiety, mood and happiness, learning and memory, and all kinds of complex behaviors. And as you grow, it gets more and more diverse, and diversity is good. And by the time a kid goes to school, he's got 100 trillion organisms in his microbiome. And it changes over life, right? And how it gets impacted depends on things like, you know, were you breastfed or formula fed, and were you given antibiotics and things like that. And then you're introduced to solid foods, and what solid foods is going to have an impact. And it goes on to how you're impacted by things like pharmaceuticals and antimicrobials and diet, infections, sex hormones, environmental toxicants, and so on. And unfortunately, this chart doesn't go any further, but in old age, your microbiome starts to decline in diversity because you tend to eat the same things over and over again, and you stop exercising like you used to. And that has an impact. But the biggest impact is how you get started. Your microbiome through life is highly impacted by your early life, first couple of years. Here's an example from 1 month to 2 years. If you're breastfed versus fed from a bottle, you will have a different propensity towards being overweight later in life. So breastfeeding is good, real good. Now, I mentioned digesting breast milk, right? It contains sugars that are not found in cow's milk. And babies can't digest breast milk sugars. And this is lactose intolerance too, by the way. Right? If you can't digest the sugars in milk, you're lactose intolerant. And those sugars, though, are important for early development. So what you need is bifidobacteria to produce the enzymes that digest the sugars in breast milk, which you don't produce yourself, has to come from your microbiome. So how do you get it? Well, even if you're not born through a natural birth, maybe your mother kisses you on the mouth and she's got them in her mouth, and she's got lactobacilli in her mouth. So when she kisses the baby, she transfers those. So question of the day, why do people kiss? This is a good reason, right? Because it promotes the viability of current and future generations. Digesting fiber produces something called a short chain fatty acid. These are important for gut health. And it turns out that they prevent weight gain, they prevent diabetes, they prevent heart disease, and they prevent the risk of cancer. or they lower it at any rate. So they also help control your immune system. They communicate with immune cells. The majority of your response to different attacks on your immune system happens in your gut. It helps control brain health. I'll talk about that more later. And here's a complicated statement, but I'll take you through it. Since most microbiota genes encode for enzymes and structural proteins that influence the functioning of mammalian cells, the gut microbiome can be viewed as an anaerobic bioreactor programmed to synthesize molecules, which direct the mammalian immune system, modify the mammalian epigenome, and regulate host metabolism. The key things to note here, it's producing enzymes and structural proteins that are programmed to synthesize molecules that talk to your epigenome and regulate your metabolism, right? These are all things that are good for you, and they're good for you as a species, and that means having these things is going to help you survive. So again, very symbiotic relationship. All of this, again, seems to center around the cecum. So your gut microbiome is where this good stuff is happening. So how do scientists test this? Well, one way to test it is you come up with an animal that doesn't have a microbiome. So how do you do it? You go into a laboratory, you find a laboratory mouse who's pregnant, and then you have it give birth through cesarean section, and then you take the baby mice and you put them in, or you maintain, a completely germ-free environment. Keep them in a glass box, and no germs can get in there. It turns out when you do that, the germ-free mice have developmental abnormalities. They don't develop like normal mice. But they can obliterate those development abnormalities by going back and introducing a microbiome into the mouse a little later, and it recovers. But you have to do it early in life. If you wait too long, it doesn't happen. It's too late. Then that says that these deficiencies they have in their mental development must be caused by the microbiome. So the microbiome has been proven to impact brain development, happens early in life. When compared with conventional mice, there's a behavior difference. Germ-free mice show greater exploratory activity in an open field activity box, meaning that they're less vigilant and cautious. Now, is that a good thing for a mouse or a bad thing for a mouse to be less vigilant and cautious? And why would it do that? Well, what they found out was the mice have diminished anxiety response. The elevation of neopinephrine is present, and neopinephrine is used to it's used in the uptake of dopamine, and they have an elevated dopamine level. Now, dopamine is a drug. I don't remember if I addressed this in here, did I? No. Dopamine is a drug that's a reward mechanism. So if you eat something that's high in sugar, you get a dopamine jolt. Where does it come from? It comes from your gut microbiome. And it's a reward for finding that sugar. Think back 50,000 years. Sugar was rare and hard to find. So being rewarded for eating sugar would give you a tendency to look for sugar and eat more of it, right? You become addicted to it because of this drug. Another thing that they found was an elevated serotonin turnover. And serotonin is a drug that's, again, produced in your gut. 50% of it is produced in your gut, and it gives you a feeling of well-being. Elevated plasma levels and adrenal, I don't want to read that. Basically what this says is germ-free mice have a heightened stress reactivity. If you put them in a stressful situation, they don't deal with it well. Germ-free rats are different though. The way they behave is they're less active and more cautious than conventional rats. So being a germ-free rat makes you less active and more cautious. Is that a good thing for a rat or a bad thing for a rat? It appears that both timidity, a behavior pattern, associated with mice, and aggressiveness, a behavior pattern associated with rats, both require a microbiome. So if you want to be a real mouse, you've got to have a healthy microbiome. Otherwise, you're not going to behave right, and you're going to have a lower viability for your current and future generations. And where the rat, you need to be a right rat, you got to have a healthy microbiome. So either behavioral deviation can significantly impair survival in the wild, and that from an evolutionary standpoint is going to be important. So the microbiome has strategic evolutionary importance. Here's an experiment that was done. There are two kinds of mice, a BALB mouse, which has its own BALB microbiome, and it's very susceptible to stressors. It doesn't deal well with stress. And then there's another kind of mouse that they use in laboratories called a Swiss mouse. It has its own microbiome, and it's less susceptible to stressors. It deals better with stress. So here's the question. If I took a BALB mouse, got a germ-free one, and I somehow implanted in it the microbiome of a Swiss mouse, would it act like a BALB mouse, or would it act like a Swiss mouse, and vice versa? And it turns out the behavior tracks the microbiome, not the mouse. So that behavior is not in the DNA, it's in the microbiome. The microbiome is forcing a behavior on the animal that it otherwise wouldn't have. Here's another example. This is a guy, John Cryan. He's in Cork, Ireland. He has a TED Talk, which you should look up if you're interested in this, because it's a really good TED Talk. But he and his team did an experiment. They fed a lactobacillus to a group of mice for several weeks, and then they had a control group that they just fed broth. And then they took the mice and they put them in a big bowl of water. And rodents are good swimmers, but they don't like water. So here's the poor mouse being experimented on, swimming around. And it turns out that the control group, the group without the lactobacillus, after 4 minutes, gives up. It goes into a dead mouse float, and that's called behavioral despair. So 4 minutes. Then they took the lactobacillus mice. They went on for 6 minutes and never went into the dead mouse float, never went into despair. They just kept swimming. And finally, they had to be pulled out so they didn't die, right? So they measured the stress hormones in the mice. The control mice had twice the cortisol of the lactose mice. And the lacto mice also had a chemical called GABA. Now, cortisol is a flight or fight hormone. This is a hormone you produce to react to stressful situations. So cortisol is normal, but it also has a lot of side effects, like you get all pumped up on adrenaline, and it has side effects that you can notice. So the control mice had twice as much as the mice with the lactobacillus. So somehow the lactobacillus is cutting down on the level of cortisol. Well, it might be the GABA. This is a neurotransmitter that's made in the brain, and it lowers stress and anxiety. But now you got to ask the question, what is making the brain produce GABA in these mice with the lactobacillus? There must be a communication path of some sort. This GABA calms the mice down that are under stress. They never panic, they never burn out, they never fall into despair. GABA is nature's Valium. So how does this get processed? Well, there's a nerve that connects the brain of a mouse to all of its internal organs. It's called the vagus nerve. You may have heard of it. So what they hypothesize is maybe there's a signal in the vagus nerve from the gut of the mouse to the mouse's brain that makes it produce GABA and gives it this natural Valium effect. So they cut the nerve and they did the experiment. And when they did that, the lacto mice behaved exactly the same as the control mice. So it's definitely a communication pathway through the vagus nerve from the gut to the brain, affecting the behavior of the mouse and affecting the hormone levels of the mouse. And they produced this chart, and you can see this this is the lactobacillus mouse. And here's the depression-like behavior resulting from having the lactobacillus. It's a lot lower than without. So definitely proven scientifically has an effect. Cortisol is a hormone. GABA is a hormone. And this proves the direct influence on the secretion of hormones and neurotransmitters. And that means that the mice with the lactobacillus have greater viability of current and future generations. So is it the same for humans? Well, we got a vagus nerve, and you can see it goes to your lungs, it goes to your heart, goes to your spleen, goes to your kidney. And look, it's all over the stomach and the lower intestine. So a clinical trial was done in France, and it didn't cut the vagus nerve, so don't worry about that. But they fed a large dose of probiotics in powder form to these French people, and they showed a dramatic reduction in basic anxiety levels. So cortisol went down. So they, even though they were Frenchmen, they were less angry, less stressed than they normally would have been. Turns out it controls your level of serotonin. 80% of serotonin is made in your gut. Now, this was a big revelation because before 20 years ago, before 20 years ago, nobody had a clue that this kind of thing was going on, that what was living in your gut would have an effect on your behavior or how you dealt with stress, right? So this is a huge development, and finding out that it's coming from your gut instead of your brain, that was a big revelation. Wow, your microbiome is giving you serotonin and it makes you feel good and it changes your behavior. And 50% of your dopamine is being made in your gut. Who would have thought? Serotonin, neurotransmitter, yeah. It stabilizes your mood, gives you feelings of happiness and well-being, and it also impacts your digestive system. So now, did the microbes plan to do this? No, it was just a happy coincidence, right? And because it was good for you, it increased your viability. Dopamine is another neurotransmitter. It's part of that whole reward motivated behavior cycle, but it also impacts motor control, and we're going to see where that's important later. Now, the microbiome, if you consider it an organ, is the only organ that can be replaced without surgery. So if there's something wrong with your microbiome, this is something you can fix, right? And if you can fix it, this may be the source of cures for diseases that we never considered before. So right now, there are multiple clinical studies underway, testing different kinds of microorganisms, different mixes of microorganisms that can be put into your gut in an effort to treat or prevent a variety of diseases. It's actually happening right now. Because what they've determined is they can change the microbiome effects, what the microbiome is producing chemically, that's going to impact potentially the behavior of the individual, if it's a mental disorder or a disease that they're subject to. So here's an example of how they've proven this out. There's a particular microbe called Clostridium difficile, C. difficile, and everybody's got it. Up to 5% of the population has it in their gut. It's not a good thing to have, though, because well, for one thing, it can be transmitted from person to person or person to fomite to person. So what's a fomite? That's the doorknob and the measurum of a gas station. Okay, anything you touch where you can leave germs and somebody can come along and touch that thing, they can pick up those germs. That's a fomite. It's a good word to know. There'll be a test later. But anyway, if the normal flora is destroyed or altered through a number of mechanisms like an aggressive antibiotic treatment, C. difficile can thrive. Because what if you take an antibiotic that kills off 30% of your microbes, but doesn't kill off the C. difficile? Then when all your microbes are starting to recover, the C. difficile increases at a greater rate than your other microbes. That can give you diarrhea, intestinal perforation, and can even kill you. Okay, so this C. difficile is a bad thing if it gets out of control. Traditionally, they treated it with antibiotics. Kill everything. Kill everything. Germs are bad, right? Germ theory. Diseases are caused by germs. So up until 30 years ago, 25 years ago, it was kill everything. That was what you did. Only has a 30% success rate, though, against C. difficile. So, because it's a hardy bug, right? And another problem with antibiotics is if you don't do the full treatment of antibiotics, you stop early because, oh, my symptoms went away. What you can end up with is a C. difficile strain in your gut that doesn't care about antibiotics. It can survive it. So if you're going to take antibiotics, do the whole thing. Now, these antibiotics are not always ideal anyway, because they're usually broad spectrum. You take an antibiotic, it's designed to kill everything. It's not designed to target a specific microbe. It's wipe out microbes, death to all microbes. And the other thing is, especially in C. difficile, it had a 30% success rate, which means it's going to come back. And it usually did. So here's one thought. And the thought was, could we fix it? Can we take this normal microbiome? It's been perturbed because somebody took a heck of a lot of it, some antibiotic, and there was a lot of C. difficile in here. And when it grew back, we got dysbiosis, too much C. difficile. What if we took a fecal cocktail from a healthy donor and somehow put it back into this person's gut? Would that cure them? Turns out the success rate is 80 to 90% if you do that. So it works. It doesn't sound very appetizing. The way they do it is they take the fecal sample, they filter it, and then they either give it to you from the back door, transcolonic infusion, or they take a tube and stick it down your nose and give it to you that way so it doesn't go through your mouth, right? But anyway, it has a very high success rate, much better than antibiotics did. It turns out this was first done 1700 years ago in ancient China. There was a doctor, a Chinese doctor, Gi Hong, who he made something he called yellow soup. I don't want to know what's in it, but he would give it to his patients with diarrhea and it would cure them. And it was probably a C. difficile infection. And it wasn't used in modern science until 1958, where somebody gave it a try and they did it using retention enemas, and the patient, they recovered. So it turns out that there's proof then that a healthy gut microbiota can reproducibly correct a severe and specific microbial dysbiosis. Now, don't try this at home. And I'll tell you why. Because it sounds like all somebody did was, you know, they got an enema and they're cured. What actually occurs when they do this is they do the introduction through an enema or through the nasal thing, or you can actually take a pill that's got the microbes inside the pill from fecal matter. But then it's followed by these pills continuing on a daily basis for a month. Okay, so this is something you have to go to a hospital to actually get done, but there are hospitals that offer this. I forget which one. There's a hospital in California that's famous for this. So if you've got something like ulcerative colitis, you can go to this hospital and they will give you this treatment and cure your ulcerative colitis. The National Academy of Sciences now promotes the study of the treatment of mental disorders by controlling the microbiome. It turns out that, you know, we're not as smart as we think we are. It turns out that our gut may be smarter than we think we are. But gastrointestinal conditions that can be caused by an imbalance are things like diarrhea, C. difficile infections, constipation, diarrhea, diverticulitis, inflammatory bowel disease, irritable bowel syndrome, traveler's diarrhea, ulcerative colitis. Ulcerative colitis is an interesting one because I saw a presentation on YouTube of a man who had ulcerative colitis, and he went to doctor after doctor, and they told him, not only do we not know what causes it, we don't have any idea how to cure it. And he went to this hospital in California where he had the introduction of new microbiome, and it cured him. So this is a relatively new thing. We're just learning how to do this stuff. Some things respond to fecal matter transplants, but some don't. Crohn's disease does not. They don't know why. Maybe Crohn's disease is a little too complicated to cure with this. But traditional treatments, modern medicine, up until 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they always went after the symptoms rather than the cause, and it was always a broad spectrum attack, kill all the microbes. And now, because of what we know, we can take a different approach. We can go to what's the cause? It's the microbiome. Let's fix that. Other conditions you can get are conditions in infants, dental disorders, allergic disorders, acne, autism is associated, diabetes is associated. Autism, by the way, responds to fecal microbiome transplants. The symptoms of autism change when there's a fecal microbiome transplant. This I found to be really interesting too. You know, here's 1950, and you know, we discovered this whole business of vaccines and antibiotics, and the antibiotics were getting better, and the vaccines were getting better, and all kinds of diseases that were associated with microbes started to go down. Measles went down, almost to nothing. Mumps, hepatitis, tuberculosis, all went down in this period from 1950 to 2000. So modern science, right, has its victory. But at the same time, chronic diseases were going up. So multiple sclerosis goes way up, Crohn's disease, way up, diabetes, way up. So whatever we were doing right was also causing something wrong. Turns out it's gut microbiome diversity that is the difference. And the way they discovered this is they took studies of people living in the USA, Malawians, and American Indians. And they said, what is the diversity of the gut microbiome of these different peoples? And there's a huge diversity in babies from Malawi and American Indians, and there is a minimal diversity in babies for us regular Americans. Same with adults. Big diversity in Malawians and American Indians, very little diversity in adults. And the other thing they looked at was diversity in diet, plants versus sugars, contact with nature, antibacterials, antibiotics. And when they look at the different types of bacteria, you can see the US has very few organisms. And in terms of diversity, American Indians have a lot more, Malawians have a lot more. So this diversity is important for a lot of aspects of health. Now you would think, as we learn these things, somebody would start to look at whether there's a convergence between the human microbiome and things like type 1 diabetes. But if you look at the number of papers that were written on the human microbiome, 65 million, and you look at the number of papers written on diabetes, over 1 trillion, there's not a lot of convergence there, right? So this is territory yet to be explored, but I think it's important. 80% of your immune system resides in the lining of your gut. So if you want to have a healthy immune system, you got to have a healthy gut. And if we look at some diseases like asthma, the incidence of asthma in countries like Canada, 14%, the US, 11%, Scotland, 18%, England, 15%, New Zealand, 15%, Australia, almost 50%. But in China and Russia and Indonesia, it's 2% or 1%. So there must be something different about maybe our diets, or maybe the microbiome that's available if you live in those areas. Celiac disease is 4.5 times more likely now than it was 60 years ago in the US. Food allergies increased 50%. Peanut and tree nut allergies, 3 times more common. Confined to the Western world. Type 1 diabetes is 10 times more likely in an Englishman than a native Pakistani. But if you move the native Pakistani to England, it's the same. So what's the difference? Probably the diet. On a global scale, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization reported that our food diversity has dropped 75% in the last 100 years. And that's definitely true in the US, right? We have a monoculture going on in the US. It's all soybeans and corn. And if you don't believe it, look at the ingredients of anything that's labeled fast food. It is full of soybeans and corn. There's this gut-brain axis I mentioned earlier. And you can see it's quite complex. And we've talked about a lot of this, but you've got an immune system that's based mainly in the lining of your gut, that's communicating with your brain. And then your brain produces hormones that have an impact on what goes on in your gut. So there's a cycle going on there. And all of this stuff is happening epigenetically. It's epigenetics that's driving the vagus nerve and how it responds. It's epigenetics that's having the body respond, and the microbiome, in fact, responding to what's going on in the brain. And all of this affects all of those different areas that relate to your health. This is an example of the behavior of people with autism. And if you look here, this is people with autism and how they respond to communicative behavior. And they don't respond well, but if they're given a particular microbe, B. fragilis, then they respond like this. So they go from being less responsive than a normal person to more responsive than a normal person in communicative behavior. So there's definitely a relationship with the autism and the microbiome. Here's the same thing in the study on the responsiveness to, or the propensity to have MS. And this is based on a fecal matter transplant study. And again, the propensity to get MS is greatly diminished by Bacteroides fragilis, B. fragilis. So that's a good one, right? That's one you want. And several studies have shown that the gut microbiome differed completely between identical twins. One of them was obese and one of them was healthy. So that tells you that the differences in whether you're fat or not is not your DNA, it's your microbiome, or at least to some extent, it's your microbiome. And it's differences in the microbiome. So how do you prove that? You take the microbiome from the fat person and you give it to a germ-free mouse, and you take the microbiome from their sibling who is not fat, and you put it in another germ-free mouse, and one of them gets fat. Guess which one? There was a study of 1,500 people about the gut microbiome and how it dealt with HDL cholesterol and triglycerides, and an unhealthy species in the gut microbiome, they found, contributes to heart disease. It produces a chemical, TMAO. Now, TMAO is a chemical that contributes to blocked arteries. So, question you want to ask yourself now is, wow, how do I avoid this TMO business? Turns out that eating red meat and animal-based forces generates TMAO, and that increases your risk factors for heart disease. So here's the first clue that, eating meat might not be such a good thing to do. The gut microbiome is involved in blood sugar, and it turns out that people that eat the same thing will have different levels of blood sugar response, and now they believe that's entwined with the gut microbiome. The diversity of the microbiome drops suddenly before the onset of type 1 diabetes, and unhealthy bacterial species increase just before the onset of type 1 diabetes. The gut microbiome impacts brain health in a number of ways, and certain species of bacteria can help produce chemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters. We talked about that a bit. Serotonin, GABA. The gut is physically connected to the brain through 100 million nerves. So there's some thought that maybe the microbiome even affects the resistance or transportability of information across those nerves. People with IBS have 30% more anxiety and 30% more depression than people who don't have it, probably because of what the gut microbiome is doing. Stressful life experience causes flares in irritable bowel syndrome. So one of the things you want to do is avoid stressful situations. But they also found that certain probiotics can improve symptoms of depression and other mental health disorders. Okay, we talked about that. This is what goes on in your guts in terms of microbes and yeasts and so on. And you see there's a lot of different kinds of populations that you can have. And what are they impacted by? Well, let's start here. Let's suppose you're born through a C-section, or a natural birth, or you're born in a hospital, or you're not born in a hospital, you're born at home, and so on. That's going to greatly impact where you start. And we saw that where you start in one of the earlier charts is very important to what goes on for the rest of your life. So that's a key situational indicator. Another thing is where you're breastfed or where you're bottle fed. That's going to have a big impact on which microbes you ingest and don't ingest and what you get exposed to. I mean, skin microbiomes are better than plastic microbiomes, right? How much stress you go through in your early life, in your working life, in your later life is all going to have an impact. And this is also going to have an impact based on where you live, right? If you live in a war zone, you're going to have a lot more stress on an ongoing, constant basis than if you live in, Oshkosh. What is your diet? And it's not just what you choose to eat, it's what your microbes tell you to eat, right? And it's also what's available to eat. Where do you live is going to have an impact. People that eat a lot of food in China are getting fed different things than people that eat a lot of food in Kansas. Kansas is famous for barbecue, right? What pharmaceuticals you get exposed to over the course of your life, where you live, what's in the soil where you live, what kind of plants are available to eat where you live, who is around you where you live. All of this is going to have an impact. And then what stage of life are you in? And that all impacts your microbiome. In the future, they're working on phage therapy. And what that is they're going to produce viruses, and they're working on this today, that will attack specific species of microbes. So if you have this C. difficile and it's making you sick, they'll infect you with a virus that goes after the C. difficile and kills it off. Maybe a good idea, maybe not a good idea, right? But they're working on it. Another one is GMO microbes. So suppose I want to give you a healthy microbe. Well, why don't I just go in and manipulate the DNA of a microbe and make it a healthy microbe and give it to you? And maybe it's designed to cure a specific disease or designed to attack a certain kind of enemy microbe or whatever. And then at the end, there are synthetic microbiomes that they're working on. In fact, I saw a company that you can actually go to now and buy a probiotic pill that they say will cure your diabetes. It's $250 a bottle, but if you're diabetic, maybe it's worth it. I don't know if it works. I looked to see what the contents of that pill was, and it turns out this is stuff you can get from foods. So don't spend the money, find the foods and eat them, because diet is extremely important. I'll talk about that more. Now, suppose you're having a problem with your skin microbiome. Now, there are ways you can help it out. Don't over sanitize. And you might not think you're over sanitizing, but Consider what kind of soap you're using. Is your soap antibacterial? Does your soap have perfumes in it, which may or may not be helpful? Does it have some kind of plastic in it that may or may not be helpful, right? So don't over sanitize. Find a soap that's good to you instead of one that's going to destroy your microbiome on your skin. Some experts think too much washing raises the odds babies will get eczema. Now, I'll bet it's not how much washing, I'll bet it's what they're washed with more than anything. Moisturize your skin, that gives the skin barrier a boost. That's a good thing. Eat a balanced diet, and you want to eat a diet that's heavy in prebiotics. And I'll tell you what prebiotics are, but basically it's stuff you can't digest without the help of your microbiome. Your microbiome is going to digest stuff like fiber when it gets to the part of your large intestine where most of your microbiome lives. That's where fiber gets digested, and that's going to be very, very helpful to you. Exercise, always a good idea. And, with your oral microbiome, it's the same thing. We've been told all our lives that you want to kill all the germs in your mouth, right? Use Listerine as a mouthwash. You want to have sweet breath? Use Listerine. Well, it turns out it's antibacterial. It's killing off your microbiome. And we know now that killing off the microbiome in your mouth can have all kinds of effects on your body. So you probably don't want to do this. If you have bad breath, I would suggest it's probably your diet that's causing you to have bad breath, not the germs in your mouth, unless the germs in your mouth are being supported by a bad diet. Another thing you want to do is stop using toothpaste. It's bad for you. I read this and I said, well, what the heck's in my toothpaste? It's bad for me. Here's what's in your toothpaste: antibiotics, antifungals, endocrine disrupting chemicals, foaming agents, artificial sweeteners, plastic, titanium oxide, which is a neurotoxin, stannous fluoride, which is an antimicrobial. So then I thought, well, what's in the toothpaste I'm using? At the time, I was a Crest user. So Crest has 3 of them. Before Crest, it was Colgate. That's got 4 of them. So, then I thought, well, is there a toothpaste that isn't going to be bad for my microbiome? So I Googled microbiome-friendly toothpaste. And I came up with 3. So now I'm using Dr. Bronner's. I also changed my shampoo. I changed my soap. I changed my deodorant. So also you want to avoid foods with antibiotics. What foods have antibiotics? Anyone? Anything that's farm raised in a factory setting. So factory farming, they use antibiotics heavily. So if you're going to buy chicken, you want to look and see, is it antibacterial chicken, or is it chicken that was not raised with antibiotics? And that's something, you can control that. Avoid over medication. It used to be if you took your kid to a doctor with a virus, the doctor would give them an antibiotic. Antibiotics don't affect viruses. So why did he do that? Well, it was a preventative measure. Kill all the germs, which is what he had been taught to do. And if you do take antibiotics, now you know that you want to restore your gut microbiome in as healthy a way as possible. So one thing about diet is a plant-based diet has more short-chain fatty acids, and they're energy sources for the cells that line the gut, and they're anti-inflammatory, so that's a good thing. Meat has fewer of those, right? So plant-based diet is a good thing. A meat-based diet is not necessarily a bad thing, but not as good. Another thing you want to do is think about prebiotics that you're eating, symbiotics and probiotics, because like I said, diet is really key. Prebiotics are non-digestible foods. You say, well, an apple, I can digest an apple. You can digest a lot of the apple, but not all of the apple. Your microbiome is responsible for digesting all the fiber in the apple. And that's what your microorganisms eat, is stuff like that, stuff that you don't normally digest without the help of the microbiome. So prebiotics have more impact on what's going on in your gut microbiome than probiotics. Probiotics increase diversity, but what you eat feeds them. So they either thrive or they don't, depending on what you eat. One prebiotic that you want to get is tryptophan. That's converted by your gut microbiome into serotonin. That makes you feel contented, happy. Another word for that is gruntled. And that's a real word. I looked it up. And it also produces melatonin that helps you sleep. And it produces vitamin B3, which affects blood cholesterol. So that's a good thing. And we all associate it with turkey, right? Because what happens when you eat turkey at Thanksgiving? You get a lot of serotonin, you feel really good, you get a lot of melatonin, you fall asleep. But there are a lot of other places to get tryptophan. But a shortage of tryptophan in your diet means you're going to be more disgruntled. You're going to have potentially trouble sleeping, and you may be subjected to cardiovascular disease. So these are a bunch of foods you can eat to get tryptophan. Got it? Okay. Another one is tyrosine. Tyrosine is converted by your gut microbiome into dopamine and a dopamine uptake drug, epinephrine. And there are a lot of places you can get that. One of the things I noticed was that cheese is good, right? All these different cheeses, they're really good for you. They got tryptophan in them. Beans have tryptophan. And if you come over here for tyrosine, same thing. Milk, yogurt, cheeses, they're good for you. Beans and wild rice, they're good for you. Firm tofu, salmon, good stuff. Oh, dopamine. I mentioned before, it's involved in motor control. Turns out studies have shown that a lack of dopamine contributes to Parkinson's disease because dopamine is involved in motor control. So no dopamine, you can't control your muscles anymore, and they start to do things on their own because you're not controlling them anymore. So if you want to age well, fix your diet. Another thing you want is indole-3 lactic acid. That's a very strong antioxidant. It's found in cultured foods. Polyphenols have anti-aging properties. They improve learning and memory, manage blood pressure, lower your risk of diabetes, lower your risk of cancer, strengthen your immune system. And there are a bunch of things. If you're going to drink red wine. That helps you, right? The vodka martini. So prebiotics, these are the best ones. You can either memorize this list or you can go to the Mediterranean diet because the Mediterranean diet is the diet that is highest in good prebiotics. So if you want to feed your microbiome, get yourself a Mediterranean diet cookbook and go with that. And this Mediterranean diet works so well, it's now being applied to something they call nutritional psychiatry. So now there are doctors, educated doctors, of course, that you can go to and say, you know, I'm feeling depressed. And the first thing he's going to ask you is, tell me about your diet, right? Which is, when's the last time a doctor asked you what you ate? So if your microbiome is not healthy, conversions of things like tryptophan, tyrosine, lactic acid, and polyphenols, it's not going to be optimal. It's not going to be as good as it could. So you got to have a healthy microbiome. I keep stressing it. One of the things that's necessary is you can have a healthy microbiome, but if your diet consists of the same crap over and over and over and over again, and that crap is maybe high in fats, the microbes that digest the fats are getting fed and they proliferate like crazy. And all the other microbes, the ones that are not fat digesters, they get starved. One of the side effects of that is now you've got a lot of fat digesting microbes that are sending signals to your brain that are saying, give me more fat, give me more fat. So there's a syndrome that can take place. If you eat the same thing, you're going to crave the same thing. And then what happens is you have a dysfunction. Now, if you want to eat your vegetables, first of all, you're not craving them. But again, when you eat them, you don't have the microbes there to do the proper digestion of them. So you want to vary your diet. Symbiotics are a combination of prebiotics and probiotics. So an example of that is kimchi. It's made from a cabbage. So that's a prebiotic, but it's also got a whole bunch of probiotics, including indole-3 lactic acid. So that's a good thing. So, if you can mix foods, have a lot of foods that have both of these benefits, that's a good thing. Probiotics are great because they increase the quality of the diversity of your microbiome. So that's a good thing. If you take a lot of antibiotics for some reason, a good thing is to eat a lot of probiotics so that you get a good mix of healthy gut bacteria back in your system. The top 7 probiotics. I go through them. Kefir is number 1. It's got tryptophan. It's got calcium and vitamin K2, and K2 is necessary to the absorption of calcium. So that's a good thing. It's got protein, a bunch of minerals and vitamins. Vitamin B12 is particularly important here because if you're a vegetarian or if you're a vegetarian, one of the things that you have difficulty with is finding a source of B12, because B12 primarily in an American diet comes from red meat. So if you're a vegetarian, where are you going to get your B12? Well, you can get it from kefir or kefir, as some people call it. And it's really powerful. It's got 15 to 27 billion colony-forming units in a serving of kefir. Now, I'm running into something here. You can go to the store and you can buy kefir, but the kefir you buy in the store is not as rich in colony-forming units. It's only got maybe 5 billion as opposed to 15 to 27. Plus, they do things like put sugar in it, which you may not want, and they put flavorings in it, which you may not want. So better to make this stuff at home. It's easy to do. I've been doing it for a while now. And there's a little ritual I have to go through in the morning where I harvest my kefir, but no big deal. Another one is kimchi. I make this too. This has got 5 billion colony-forming units in it. It's not as good as kefir, but it's got some other things that kefir doesn't have, like iron and copper and calcium is there. This is the thing that started this whole talk, remember? The guy with a Bulgarian family lived on Bulgarian yogurt and lived into their 70s and 80s, which was unheard of in Europe because of Bacillus bulgaricus. And you can buy this in the store too. I don't know how good it is coming from a store. I have no experience with this. Again, this is something you can make at home. I make my own yogurt too. It doesn't take a lot of time. I mean, most of the time you're waiting for something to happen, because it's all fermentation based. So, to make yogurt, you go buy some Fayet and you take 3 tablespoons of it and you put it in a quart jar and you fill it with milk. You put it in your oven, you close the door and you turn on the light. And the next day, you've got a quart of yogurt. Okay, how long did that take? If you buy yogurt in the store, another thing you want to look for is, does it have active cultures? Because if it doesn't, it's not doing you any good necessarily, right? You want the active cultures. You want to feed your microbiome. Kombucha, you can buy that in the store. And again, they put sugar in it. They put flavorings in it. It may or may not be alive, and the test for that is when you open it, does it fizz at you or not, right? But this is another thing you can make at home. I'm not doing this one. Sauerkraut's a great thing. For hundreds of years, sauerkraut juice was the preeminent cure for a hangover. So next time you get a hangover, drink some sauerkraut juice, see if it works. It turns out sauerkraut juice is really good for you. This one is so disgusting, I won't talk about it. And then, of course, there's pickles. The danger with pickles, as my wife keeps telling me, is there's an awful lot of salt in there, Ron. So if you have high blood pressure, that's probably not a great thing. But pickles are really good for you. Pickle juice is really good for you to just drink out of the jar. And, you may think that's strange, but it is good for you. Do I have time to talk about this? I guess I do. You have a lining in your large intestine called your mucosal membrane. And if it's degraded, it can lower your immune response because that's where your immune system lives. It can lead to inflammation, leaky gut. But if you have a healthy microbiome, it can be restored. And it has to be restored on a daily basis. And one of the things that gets in the way of it being restored is if there's stuff in the way. So one of the things that I see recommended over and over again is a thing called partial fasting, which basically is skip breakfast. And while you're skipping breakfast, you're leaving a space in your large intestine where the mucosal membrane can restore itself. And then, of course, you have to feed it. Well, plant fiber generates butyrate, which generates mucin, which repairs the mucosal membrane. So plant fiber is a really good thing to follow up with. Animal protein, on the other side, generates methionine and cysteine, which produces sulfur, which gets converted to sulfate-reducing bacteria, turning it into hydrogen sulfate gas, and that breaks down the mucosal membrane. So here's another reason why maybe eating a lot of meat is not such a great thing for you. People talk a lot about comfort food. So why is a food a comfort food? Well, if you eat a lot of starches, you know, they tend to be comfort foods. Carbohydrates tend to be comfort foods because they produce more serotonin, right? So when you eat this food, you actually feel better. Eat this, you'll feel better. This is something Italian mothers would want to say, right? And then all this protein stuff, it doesn't generate a lot of serotonin. So, you know, one of the reasons you feel good when you're eating certain foods is because of what your microbiome is doing down there. So there's an ancient Zen Buddhist saying, to know and not to do is not to know. Well, now you know. So here's what you do. You change your diet and you see what to do, right? Cultured foods, Mediterranean diet, minimize your stress. If you don't want to learn to meditate, learn to box breathe. It's real easy. Come see me later and I'll tell you how to do it. Get some exercise. Don't over medicate. Right? This is something Americans love to do. Oh, I feel a little anxiety. There's a pill for that, you know, but that pill for that is getting in the way of what your system should be doing on its own if you only did the other things. And don't over sanitize. You know, this whole concept of germs are bad for you is really misleading. And it was invented at a time when we didn't know about epigenetics and we didn't know about the microbiome. So we were ignorant. And what's the first rule of Dunning-Kruger Club? You don't know you're in Dunning-Kruger Club. And what's the second rule of Dunning-Kruger Club? You're in Dunning-Kruger Club. Okay, and that's my talk. Anybody have any?
You can turn your Zoom camera on.
Oh, okay.
This is just two sides of our opinion more than fact, but I've got to follow your gut. And you've got, after you are really sick, I found in my life, even if it's when you haven't been eating because you're so sick you don't eat whatever you feel like eating when you're starting to feel better. Like even if it's a weird thing, like you just came off of a terrible illness and you feel like you eat it. I think your gut, and I tell a lot of people that, and they find it works. Your gut is telling you what, your brain is really, and your gut telling you what to eat. The other thing is, nowadays, too much sanitation and too much worrying about germs. We use too much chlorine bleach on everything, and that's really bad.
Yeah.
And let your children go out and play in the dirt and eat it if they need some of it. It's good for them.
Let them kiss that pig. Well, one of the things that we found too is that households with dogs are healthier than households without dogs. They have healthier microbiome. Why is that? You know, dogs bring everything into the house and then they share it with you and your family. But it's a good thing.
So next time I'm at the dentist and they want to give me a healthy cleaning, should I tell them no?
Well, no, I mean, a tooth cleaning is a good thing because it's taking away tartar. But I'll tell you one thing, since I started using a microbiome friendly toothpaste, I have no tartar built up. It actually stopped. So when I go for my next cleaning, they're going to say, you know, how'd you do that? And you know, and it all comes from this whole business of let's kill all the germs in our mouths. Well, the germs in your mouths are actually doing stuff for you. So maybe don't. Anybody else? My work here is done.